Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. My grandfather purchased our 40-acre farm back in 1947 when nobody wanted this land. He always told me, "They ain't making any more land, son. Hold on to it." 3 generations later, I'm still working the same soil, growing the heirloom tomatoes that have become something of a local legend in our county. Our farm sits just outside the city limits, which has been both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is fewer regulations and lower taxes. The curse is watching suburban sprawl inch closer every year. What used to be miles of farmland around us has slowly transformed into subdivisions with names like Meadow Vista Estates that cropped up about 5 years ago. The irony isn't lost on me that they named their concrete jungle after the meadows they destroyed to build it. I've lost count of how many developers have shown up at my door with checkbooks in hand. "You're sitting on a gold mine," they always say. But this land is worth more than money to me. I live simply in the same farmhouse my grandfather built, though I've added indoor plumbing and internet since his day. My days start before sunrise and end long after sunset, but there's something deeply satisfying about working land that's been in your family for generations. This whole mess started last spring when I attended the annual agricultural conference 3 counties over. I go every year to learn about new sustainable farming techniques and catch up with other farmers. I was gone for just 7 days. When I pulled into my driveway after that week away, something immediately felt wrong. There were tire tracks cutting across my east field where I had just planted 2 acres of my prized tomatoes. Following the tracks, I discovered construction equipment parked on my property and what looked like a partially completed gravel road slicing through my field. I can't properly describe the feeling in my gut at that moment. It was like someone had punched me. That east field had some of my best soil, carefully tended for decades. The crop damage alone would cost me around $20,000 in lost revenue, not counting the damage to the soil itself. A construction crew was taking a lunch break under one of my old oak trees. I approached them, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Excuse me, but what exactly are you doing on my property?" I asked. The foreman looked confused. "We're building the access road for Meadow Vista Estates. Got all the paperwork right here." He handed me a folder with permits and what appeared to be a signed permission form with my signature at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature. Someone had forged my name. "This isn't my signature," I said. "I never authorized any road through my property." The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Look, we're just doing the job we were hired for. You'll need to take this up with the developer and the homeowners association. We were told everything was squared away." I asked them to stop work immediately, and to their credit, they did. But the damage was already done. A 20-foot wide gravel path cut through my east field, connecting the back of the new subdivision directly to the highway. It would save residents about 10 minutes on their commute, at the expense of my livelihood. The next day, I went to speak with the HOA president, a woman who'd moved to the area from the city about 3 years prior. When I explained the situation, she barely looked up from her laptop. "Mr. Farmer," she said, not even bothering to use my actual name, "that access road is for the greater good of our community. It's going to increase property values and decrease commute times for over 100 families. But it's on my property," I explained. "Nobody asked my permission. Nobody paid me for the land, and you've destroyed my crops." She sighed dramatically. "No one actually farms anymore anyway. It's the 21st century. If you're concerned about compensation, you can bring it up at our next board meeting, but the road is staying. We've been planning this improvement for months." I was stunned by her dismissal. "That's not how property rights work," I said. "You can't just build on someone else's land because it's convenient for you." "We'll see," she replied with a smirk that made my blood boil. "See you at the board meeting." That afternoon, I called a local surveying company to officially confirm my property boundaries, which cost me $1,500. I also consulted with a lawyer who specialized in property rights, which was another $350 just for the initial consultation. Both confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had absolutely no right to build on my land, and the signature on their form was definitely a forgery. My lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter, which I personally delivered to the next HOA board meeting. I sat through an hour of discussions about playground equipment and lawn height restrictions before they finally got to new business. When I presented the letter, the room erupted. The HOA president claimed that residents had been using that pathway for years, which was a complete lie. The subdivision wasn't even 5 years old, and there had never been any path through my field before this. "We have an easement by prescription," she declared confidently, as if she'd just learned the term. "We've established a right-of-way through historical use." My lawyer had warned me they might try this argument. That's simply not true, I replied. There was no path until last week, and your subdivision has only existed for 5 years. Prescriptive easements typically require open and continuous use for at least 20 years in this state. Another board member, a man in an expensive golf shirt, leaned forward. Look, why don't you just sell that worthless farm to developers like a sensible person? You're fighting progress. The meeting devolved from there. I was called selfish, outdated, and an obstacle to community improvement. One woman even suggested they should investigate me for animal welfare violations, though I don't even raise livestock on my property. As I was leaving, one of the quieter board members caught up with me in the parking lot. He looked around nervously before speaking. You should know, he said in a low voice. The board discussed this months ago. They knew they didn't have the right to build on your land. But the president convinced everyone you wouldn't fight back. She said farmers are too poor to hire lawyers. He hurried away before I could respond. With the legal documentation in hand and the cease and desist delivered, I gave them exactly 1 week to respond. When they didn't, I took action. I hired a local fence company to install a heavy-duty gate across the illegal road, complete with no trespassing and private property signs. The gate and installation cost me $3,200, but it was worth every penny. The response was immediate and hostile. Cars would drive up to the gate at all hours and honk continuously. Someone let the air out of my truck tires. Suddenly, there were noise complaints filed about my tractor, which I'd been using at the same hours for decades. 2 weeks after I installed the gate, I was served with lawsuit papers. The HOA was suing me for irreparable harm to the community, demanding the road remain open and seeking $275,000 in damages for emotional distress and decreased property values. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Local Farmer Blocks Access Road, Residents Outraged." The article quoted several residents calling me selfish and saying I was preventing parents from getting home to their children quickly. There was barely a mention of the fact that the road was built illegally on my property without permission. At this point, I was angry enough to consider selling just to be done with these people. But then I remembered my grandfather's words about holding on to the land. I called my lawyer and told him I wanted to fight this all the way. We filed a comprehensive response to their lawsuit, along with our own countersuit for property damage to my crops, approximately $20,000, trespassing, forgery of documents, harassment. My lawyer started the discovery process, requesting all HOA board minutes related to the road project, communications between board members, and contracts with the construction company. What we found was shocking, but not surprising. The HOA president owned not just her home in the subdivision, but also a rental property on the far side that would increase significantly in value with easier access to the highway. She had a direct financial interest in the road that she never disclosed to the other board members. We also discovered emails where she explicitly discussed forging my signature, writing to another board member, "He'll never know until it's too late, and then what's he going to do?" Farmers don't have money for lawyers. The construction company provided testimony that the HOA president had personally authorized the work and provided the fake signature. Satellite imagery from 3 different dates clearly showed there had been no road or pathway through my property until the construction began during my absence. As we built our case, I found unexpected allies. A local environmental group became concerned that the unauthorized road was affecting water runoff into a nearby creek. Several longtime residents from neighboring properties came forward with statements supporting my version of events. Even a few homeowners from the subdivision privately expressed support, embarrassed by their HOA actions. The financial strain was significant. Between legal fees, the survey, and the gate, I had already spent nearly $15,000, which was money I had been saving for a new irrigation system. But I refused to give in. The court date finally arrived 6 months after they filed their lawsuit. The judge, an older woman who had grown up in a rural community herself, listened carefully to both sides. When the HOA president claimed they had been using the pathway for years, the judge asked a simple question. Can you provide any evidence of this pathway existing before last spring? They couldn't, of course. When they tried to argue that the road served a greater community need, the judge interrupted. The greater good doesn't override private property rights in this country, she said firmly. If you wanted an easement across this property, there are legal means to request one and compensate the owner appropriately. After just 40 minutes of testimony, the judge dismissed the HOA lawsuit. She then immediately addressed our countersuit, ruling in my favor on all counts. Her decision included, the HOA must remove the road and restore my land to its previous condition, compensation of $22,500 for lost crops and restoration costs, punitive damages of $50,000 for the deliberate forgery and trespassing, a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from entering my property. The HOA was responsible for my legal fees, approximately $18,000. The judge was particularly harsh about the forgery. Falsifying someone's signature on a legal document is fraud, plain and simple, she said. Had this been pursued criminally rather than civilly, someone might be facing jail time. 2 weeks after the ruling, the HOA board called an emergency meeting and asked for the president's resignation. The local paper ran a follow-up story with a very different tone. Local farmer vindicated, HOA built illegal road, forged documents. The aftermath was more positive than I could have imagined. With the settlement money, I did something my grandfather would have approved of. I worked with a land conservation trust to place a permanent easement on 20 acres of the farm, ensuring it could never be developed regardless of who owned it in the future. I still had full rights to farm the land, but it would remain agricultural in perpetuity. I also started a small educational program, inviting the local elementary school to bring students out to learn about farming. Surprisingly, many of these children came from the very subdivision that had caused all the trouble. They were fascinated by the tomato plants and couldn't believe food came from the ground rather than the grocery store. The new HOA board took a completely different approach. The new president, actually the quiet man who had warned me in the parking lot, reached out to apologize formally. After several discussions, we worked out an agreement for a proper, legal walking path along the edge of my property, far from my crops. They paid fair market value for the narrow easement, and it gave families a nice place to walk without cutting through my fields. Most surprisingly, several of the subdivision residents who had been most vocal against me now regularly stopped by my farm stand to buy tomatoes. One woman even admitted, "I had no idea what was really going on. The old board just told us you were being difficult." It's been 2 years since that court case. The field is productive again, though it took a lot of work to restore the soil properly. The walking path is popular with families, and the kids from the educational program sometimes bring their parents to show them their tomato plants. Standing up against that HOA was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There were nights I lay awake wondering if it was worth the fight, if I should just sell the land and retire somewhere peaceful. But every morning when I walk my fields at sunrise, I'm grateful I held my ground. My grandfather always said, right is right even if you're the only one doing it. I think he'd be proud that his farmland is still growing food, still teaching lessons, and still in the family after all these years. Some things really are worth fighting for. The next one is a pro-revenge story. A few years ago, I was sitting in a job interview and the hiring manager asked, "What do you consider the greatest accomplishment of your career?" This gave me pause, as I've been doing the same thing for over 25 years. I let the mists of memory transport me back in time. Dorian, the nurse manager. Kip, the program manager. Dr. Steve, the clinical director. Yes, I had 3 bosses. I started on the unit as an already seasoned, jaded RN, and soon discovered that most staff who worked there were very, very young and inexperienced. For many, this was their first real job. They assumed all the weird stuff that happened every day was just normal for the workplace. Dorian had decreed that no one was allowed to write incident reports for med errors or safety issues because it makes me look bad in safety huddle. Non-clinical staff allowed to pass meds, schedule changes without notice. Additionally, the department was easily the most toxic I've ever worked in, with various cliques at constant war with one another. I could go on and on. The troubles began one day when I opened my email to a message from Dorian which stated very curtly that I was being investigated for an incident which had happened on the unit, that I was to meet with HR to discuss it and for possibly disciplinary action. I was not to discuss the incident with anyone. No date was given, no medical record number, no indication what the issue could be. I replied that I would need the above information, would speak with my union rep and meet at a time convenient for me. Dorian declined to give information. I declined to meet with him. I began receiving emails almost daily, each more threatening than the last. I printed them all, contacted my sister, the employment attorney, tried not to start shaking whenever I had to check my email. I was keenly aware that this is intimidation 101, but it is remarkably effective even when you know that. Because I'm not a direction follower, I was soon discussing this in the break room, and before I knew it, had been approached by 3 other women who had all received the same email on the same day. Comparison showed the emails being sent about a minute apart. We did not work the same shifts nor the same days. We agreed to call in the union rep and refused to meet with HR. Dorian continued to escalate, including cornering us in the hall, stepping in chest to chest and trying to stare us down. He was a very big guy. Before long, we were speaking to more and more women, and it came to light that Dorian had a habit of targeting them with this exact email, followed by others that were more and more threatening until the person would finally meet with HR, get written up for something vague, and then be forced to sign a non-disclosure/no retaliation agreement. It seemed that he had simply picked the wrong 4 women this time because we were not having it. I can't tell you how much time at work began to be spent with people crying while recounting their stories. None had thought to call in the union rep. They did not even know their Weingarten rights. We began to plot. We had limited time, and our company has a long and unglamorous history of protecting people like this. Before long, the entire team was united against the common enemy. LGBTQ staff wrote up statements, backed with witnesses, of grossly homophobic comments, often in the presence of patients. Staff who were immigrants made statements about racial slurs. A staff who was incredibly petty and vindictive had been compiling a dossier on every perceived policy violation and wrongdoing on Dorian's part since his hiring date, and he prepped it for presentation to HR. The graveyard shift, all huge men, said, "Obviously Dorian isn't trying to flex on us, but we want to help." So they spent a couple nights cruising Dorian's social media posts and capturing screenshots of homo, trans, xenophobic, and misogynistic content. Worried that they hadn't done enough, the night staff paid for a cheap background check, and what a score. DUI, failure to appear, hit and run, domestic violence, assault with a deadly weapon. Did the company not do a background check? WTF. Finally, 2 women came forward with complaints of sexual harassment. One incident had even occurred in the presence of the assistant manager, and one was documented in an email. We were ready. We flooded HR with meeting requests, and our union rep coordinated the assault so that on Monday we met for simple harassment and intimation. I met first, and HR seemed unimpressed by my complaint. Tuesday, all LGBTQ and staff subjected to racial slurs made their formal complaints. They said that the HR lady looked tired. Wednesday started with the background check, moved into the minutiae of policy violation, and culminated with well-documented quid pro quo sexual harassment. The union rep informed HR that the union's attorney was eager to know how to proceed. HR assured her that would not be necessary. That evening, Dorian posted a sign on his office door saying he would be away for a few days and to contact Kip or Dr. Steve if we needed anything. Graveyard Shift reported that over the weekend, housekeeping came and removed everything from his office except his name tag, which the night staff took as a trophy. On Monday at shift change, the CNO, COO, and HR met with the team and informed us that effective immediately, Dorian was no longer employed by the hospital. We all sat silently and politely until they exited the unit when a loud and spontaneous cheer went up. People were hugging each other and cry-laughing, high fives all around. Aftermath. To the best of my knowledge, Dorian never worked as an RN again. Frankly, I don't care. Kip was fired 3 days later for having been aware of all that was going on and turning a blind eye, and because apparently he'd been touching women on the unit for a couple years. I hadn't been aware of that, but it came out in the HR meetings. Dr. Steve was also fired for sexual harassment. The unit hired an old manager of mine who had a long and well-documented history of, you guessed it, sexual harassment. I quit within days of him being offered the job. The department's foray into getting along crumbled. Most of the staff have moved on to other jobs where they seem much happier. What do you consider the greatest accomplishment of your career? I sat up straight, smiled, and said, I took a very fractured team and brought them together to achieve a common goal. I like to think I'm really good at team building. The next one is a malicious compliances story. So I have a Karen for a neighbor. She's a grumpy old C with a live-in son in his 40s and no other family or friends. And when I say she's a Karen, we're talking to the point that she came into my property to yell at our landscaper about a boulder he was installing on our property, something about believing it would fall over onto more of our property. A few months after we moved in, we receive a letter trying the HOA saying they'd received complaints and asking that we make sure we're mowing, watering, and maintaining. I chalked it up to moving into a nicer neighborhood and made an effort to mow twice a week instead of my normal once, added a little time to the sprinklers, and figured all was good. Apparently, it was not all good, as we received another letter stating the complaints had continued and the HOA wanted to talk with us to see what the problem was. I should note, we had just moved in not that long ago, and hadn't landscaped the back yet, so we're letting our dogs pee on the front at night, which lead to the inevitable patches of bright green grass that grow stupid fast. Now, I'll freely admit I don't keep my yard to the level of some of my neighbors, but it was in perfectly good shape outside some green spots in an otherwise average-looking yard, and I do my best to keep things mowed and looking decent. Turns our grumpy C had taken real offense to this and started complaining to the HOA. The hearing ended up bringing mostly incoherent rambling, but the bottom line was she didn't like how our lawn looked with the green spots. While the HOA agreed this was not her business and definitely not theirs, I decided she was right and we should stop letting our dogs out in the front to pee, as I also don't like the green spots. Now I put them on the leash and let them do their business in her yard. Read, tree lawn. And I'm clearly not the only one, as her entire yard is now covered in pee spots and dead spots on her actual lawn, which my dogs don't step for on. I'm pretty sure she's complained about everyone with a dog, and now the entire neighborhood takes their dogs to her yard. The best part, she actually does a crap job taking care of her lawn, weeds, and crabgrass everywhere. She just waters it almost non-stop. So today I got to report her to the HOA for her yard looking like total crap. If it were any other house, there are much worse, I wouldn't care at all. But this lady wanted lawns without spots, so I'm just doing my part to enforce her rules. Edit. To everyone hating on HOA. They're hit and miss for sure, but in this case, they didn't do anything but tell me someone complained and then tell her I wasn't violating any rules and they weren't going to be involved. Also, HOA are often surprisingly easy to take over. You just have to skip the whining about how terrible they are and do the work instead. If the HOA is that bad, talk to some neighbors, tell them you're going to run for the board, and get them to vote for you. Then, help others do the same. And remember what you hated about the previous board. Be forewarned. Everyone finds a reason to complain. No one is will to help out. Edit 2 for everyone about green grass from dog pee, urea, ammonium, nitrogen for plants. If you don't water, it stays concentrated in one area, killing the grass. If you do water or just spray the spot with a hose quickly, it's diluted and gives the grass a big boost of organic nitrogen fertilizer. The next one is an entitled People Story. Okay, so here's another story from my time working at the very popular theme park in Florida. This incident is one that almost made me quit. I was working as a cashier at the bakery store area of the resort I worked at. It was really busy and my line was long. I was a fast cashier, so I was moving through the guests quickly. I hear an older man and woman arguing with each other as they come up through my line. I mind my business as I ring up their things. The man says with an attitude that he needs a cup for coffee. I grab one, sit it on the counter, and ring it up with the rest of their things. I tell them their total, and they pull out their room card to pay. Room cards were connected to guests' IDs, and guests could also connect a debit or credit card to them to make things easier during their vacation. I go through the process of charging the card, but the computer won't read it. I do it multiple times, and still nothing. Older woman. This is the second card that's doing this. Older man. Well, what am I supposed to do about it? She's the one that doesn't know what she's doing. Referring to me. Me. Sir, do you have the debit or credit card associated with the room card? I can just use that. Older man. If I had that, I wouldn't have handed you the room key. Why can't you do your job? At this point, I'm trying to calm down and remain not ignorant. A nice guest behind the man chimes in and says to the older gentleman that if it's happened 2 times already, it's probably because they are putting it next to their cell phone or something else that is demagnetizing it because it happened to him as well. Older man to nice young gentleman, who asked you? The young man raises his hand and says sorry sarcastically, while other guests look at the older couple like they're nuts and look at me with sympathy. Me. Sir, ma'am, do you have another form of payment? The man throws the stuff they had angrily on the counter and his wife follows, knocking the cup on the ground. Some people leave the line. The welcome desk ladies some feet behind me stare on in bewilderment. Older man, I don't even want this crap anymore. All I wanted was a coffee. Me wanting them to just leave my line and my nerves. Here, I'll give you the coffee for free. I hand him another cup, which he attempts to snatch, causing this one to also drop to the ground. He picks it up angrily and throws it at me. Older man. I need another one! Y'all, I'm shaking. What I'm feeling at that moment wasn't anger, it was wrath. I'm brown, but my face and neck were red. I then understood why God didn't give humans superpowers, because I would have reduced that entire place to ashes, starting with the older couple. Everything would have gone up in flames. I grabbed another cup and sat it on the counter. Before handing it to the man, I calmly spoke to him. Me. Sir, instead of acting like this, All you had to do was ask. You see that desk behind me? They can print you a new card if you need it. Him and his wife seemed to deflate, but said nothing as I handed him the cup. I then asked them to leave my line, and they walked away. The nice man and his woman looked at me with pity, and the woman said she was sorry I had to go through that. I managed to ring up their things, but couldn't continue, so I called my manager on the phone that was next to the cash register. She answered and instantly knew by my voice something was wrong. I told her I needed a break. I couldn't be there right now. She said okay, and she was on the way. She came out a minute later and told me to take a breather. I couldn't even make it to the worker break room bathroom before the tears started, so I ran to the guest bathroom into a stall and cried there. I cried not because I was sad, but because I was angry and had to suppress it. I was boiling over like a pot of water on the inside. Throughout that week, no matter where I saw that man and his wife, I gave them the nastiest stank eye I could muster up. Suddenly, they were super nice to everyone else, refused to make eye contact with me longer than a few seconds, and they never apologized, though they looked guilty whenever they saw me. The next one is an entitled parent story. I work at a bowling alley, and today we had a large tournament, roughly 6 people on all 40 lanes. At the start of the day, it was nice and quiet until about 2. 3 hours, and the kid, who was maybe 10, 12, that was sat directly in front of the front counter iPad, ran out of battery. The kid lost at this point, practically screaming at his mother to charge it or to play on her phone. She clearly didn't care. She basically told him to sit down and shut up. The kid only did half that. He started walking around the counter. Then he noticed the iPad we have behind the counter to help keep track of reservations and parties, etc. His face lit up like it was Christmas morning, as I always do when a kid runs behind the counter. I stop them and say, "Whoa, little buddy can't be back here." The kid then looked up at me, pointed to the iPad, and said, "But I want it." "Sorry, little dude, but that's our important iPad. I can't let you have it." The kid said, "Oh," and walked away. Me, thinking that was the end of it, went back to tending to lane calls, score corrections, and all the usual stuff that happens when a tournament is going on. Then about maybe 5 minutes later, I see out of the corner of my eye the kid sneaking around the side of the counter and reaching out to the iPad. Once again, I told him he can't have it this time, with a bit more of a strict tone to tell him I'm serious. With me still looking at him, he reached out more and more until he grabbed it and ran. Luckily, he didn't get far as he tripped over one of the many ball bags strewn across the floor from the bowlers. However, unfortunately, he landed on the tiled-off eating area, smashing the tablet on the ground. Naturally, the kid started bawling. I rush over, grab the iPad off the ground, only for some of the glass to fall out. The mother was none too pleased at this. She looked beet red as she hurried over and shouted, "How could you hurt my little pumpkin?" I explained to her the situation and how her child tripped and smashed the iPad, and she gave the stereotypical, "My child is an angel and can do no wrong" speech, and demanded that we pay her for a new iPad for her son. I told her that's not how this works, and she started to cause a scene. The tournament head came over, noticing the commotion, and asked what was going on. Obviously, we both gave out sides of the story. He then said that since the damage happened during his tournament, he would reimburse us for the damaged iPad, but the mother, son, and her bowler were all kicked out and the bowler disqualified. Honestly, I feel bad for the bowler. He was doing pretty good in the tournament, but thanks to a crappy parent, it was all null and void. I talked with the official later, and he said that she's been a problem at other places before for similar issues, such as being too rowdy and not watching her kid. Apparently, she was warned at their last tournament that if it happened again, her son would be disqualified from the tournament. I feel bad for him, but oh well. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.